There was a time in America when food labels did not exist. A factory could work children for brutal hours and no law would stop it. A bank could collapse overnight and take a family's entire savings with it. A woman could be denied the vote simply because of her gender. A disabled person could be completely shut out of public buildings, public schools, and public life. A worker could lose a hand on a machine and have no legal recourse. A family could be turned away from a neighborhood, a hospital, or a polling place because of the color of their skin. None of these things disappeared by accident. They changed because laws changed. And once those laws changed, ordinary life in America changed with them. These are the major American laws that changed daily life. Before the United States had a constitution, it had something even simpler. It had a question. What rights does an ordinary person actually have? The Bill of Rights, ratified in 1791, answered that question directly. Before those first 10 amendments, the new American government had enormous power and few written limits. Citizens were anxious. Several states refused to ratify the Constitution unless specific protections were guaranteed, so James Madison drafted a list. The right to speak, the right to worship, the right to assemble, the right to a fair trial, protection from unreasonable searches, protection from being forced to testify against yourself. These were not abstract principles. They were rules about what the government could and could not do to an ordinary person on an ordinary day. Before these protections, a citizen could be silenced, searched, or imprisoned with far fewer obstacles. After them, the government had to justify itself in court. The Bill of Rights did not solve every injustice. Many of its protections were denied to enslaved people, to women, to non-citizens. Historians are clear that the gap between the promise and the reality was enormous. But the framework existed. And over the next 2 centuries, Americans would fight to make those protections real for more and more people. Every courtroom today, every free press, every protest march happens inside the legal space the Bill of Rights created. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed a law that gave ordinary Americans something almost unimaginable: free land. The Homestead Act offered 160 acres of public land to any citizen who was willing to live on it and work it for 5 years. Before this law, land in America was mostly controlled by wealthy landowners, speculators, and the government. A poor family had almost no realistic path to owning land unless they had money or connections. The Homestead Act changed that equation. Hundreds of thousands of families, veterans, immigrants, freedmen, single women in some cases, packed everything they had and moved west. They built sod houses on the Great Plains. They broke frozen ground in Nebraska and Kansas. They planted crops in soil that had never been farmed before. The law was not perfect. Much of the best land was grabbed by speculators before ordinary settlers could reach it. Indigenous peoples were dispossessed to make that land available. The full story of westward expansion includes enormous suffering alongside the opportunity. But for millions of families, the Homestead Act meant something personal and permanent. It meant that, for the first time, they owned the ground they stood on. Owning land meant stability. It meant credit. It meant a future. The idea that an American family could own property and build wealth from it traces back, in part, to that single law. In 1865, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States. It is one of the most significant legal changes in American history, and it changed daily life in the most direct way possible. It changed who was a person under the law. Before the 13th Amendment, 4 million people in the American South were legally considered property. They could be bought, sold, separated from their families, and forced to work without pay or freedom. The amendment ended that. The 14th Amendment followed in 1868. It guaranteed citizenship and equal protection under the law to all people born in the United States. For the first time, formerly enslaved people were legally citizens. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, guaranteed that the right to vote could not be denied based on race. Together, these 3 amendments rewrote the legal foundation of American life. But the gap between the law on paper and the reality on the ground was devastating. Sharecropping replaced slavery for many. Black codes in southern states restricted movement, work, and daily freedom. Violence and intimidation were used to suppress the vote for generations. Historians are careful to note that these amendments were a beginning, not an ending. The rights they promised would be fought over, denied, and eventually reclaimed across the next 100 years. But the legal architecture was there, and it mattered enormously that it was. In 1882, Congress passed a law that went in the opposite direction entirely. The Chinese Exclusion Act was the first major federal law to restrict immigration based on race and nationality. Before this law, Chinese workers had come to the United States by the tens of thousands. They had built railroads across the West. They had mined for gold in California. They had built laundries, farms, and small businesses in cities from San Francisco to New York. The Exclusion Act barred Chinese laborers from entering the country. It prevented Chinese immigrants already in the United States from becoming citizens. It made it illegal for them to naturalize no matter how long they had lived here. In daily life, this meant families could not reunite. Workers already here were cut off from bringing their wives and children. Entire communities were frozen in place. The act was renewed and expanded multiple times. It remained law for 60 years until 1943. Its legacy shaped Chinese American communities for generations. It also established a precedent that the federal government could and would use immigration law to define who was welcome in America and who was not. That precedent did not disappear when the act was repealed. It shaped immigration policy debates for the rest of the century. In 1906, an unlikely thing changed American kitchens. A novelist named Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle. He intended it as a story about the suffering of immigrant workers in Chicago's meatpacking industry. What he did not expect was that Americans would be most horrified by the meat itself. The book described in sickening detail what actually went into American food: rotten meat reclassified and resold, chemicals used to disguise spoilage, filth processed alongside product, rats and rat poison swept into sausage. Americans were disgusted. President Theodore Roosevelt ordered federal inspectors into meatpacking plants. The results confirmed what Sinclair had described. Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. For the first time, it became illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport adulterated or mislabeled food and drugs across state lines. Products had to be what they said they were. Drugs had to list their ingredients. Misleading labels became a federal offense. Before this law, patent medicines made wild, unverifiable claims. Syrups and tonics sold to families often contained high levels of alcohol, opium, or cocaine. There was no requirement to tell the buyer what was inside. The Pure Food and Drug Act changed that. It eventually led to the Food and Drug Administration, the institution that today tests medicines before they reach pharmacy shelves. The next time you read a nutrition label or check a medication's ingredients, that act of checking exists because a law made it possible. In 1913, two pieces of legislation reshaped how American money worked. The Federal Reserve Act created a central banking system for the United States. Before this law, American banking was chaotic. Bank panics were common. In 1907, a financial crisis nearly collapsed the entire system. Families who kept savings in banks could lose everything overnight when a bank failed, with no insurance, no backup, and no recourse. The Federal Reserve gave the government tools to manage the money supply, stabilize banks, and act as a lender of last resort during crises. The same year, the 16th Amendment was ratified, giving Congress the power to collect income taxes. Before the income tax, the federal government raised money primarily through tariffs on imported goods. That system was unpredictable and heavily criticized as unfair. The income tax made the federal government financially powerful in a new way. It also touched ordinary life directly. For the first time, millions of Americans had a direct financial relationship with the federal government. The money taken from wages was now part of the national conversation in a way it had never been before. These two changes, a central bank and a federal income tax, quietly became the financial backbone of modern American life. In 1920, the 18th Amendment made it illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport alcohol in the United States. Prohibition. The temperance movement had been building for decades. Reformers, churches, and social activists argued that alcohol was destroying families, fueling crime, and corrupting public life. When Prohibition took effect, it changed daily behavior almost immediately. Saloons closed, legal breweries and distilleries shut down. For many Americans, particularly recent immigrants from Germany, Italy, and Ireland, for whom alcohol was a central part of culture and social life, Prohibition felt like a direct attack on their way of living. What followed was something few reformers had predicted. Illegal bars called speakeasies opened across the country by the thousands. Bootleggers became wealthy. Organized crime, led by figures like Al Capone in Chicago, built enormous empires supplying illegal alcohol. Government corruption exploded. Enforcement was inconsistent, expensive, and often absurd. By 1933, the 21st Amendment repealed Prohibition. It remains the only constitutional amendment to repeal another. Prohibition's legacy is complicated. Alcohol consumption did drop significantly during those years. Some public health outcomes improved. But the law also created a massive underground economy and demonstrated how difficult it is to legislate behavior that millions of people consider personal. The lesson echoed through American policy debates for the rest of the century. In 1935, Franklin Roosevelt signed a law that changed what it meant to grow old in America, the Social Security Act. Before Social Security, old age in America was often a financial crisis. There was no national pension, no federal safety net. When a person's body could no longer work, they depended entirely on family, charity, or continued labor for survival. The Great Depression had wiped out savings, pensions, and jobs across the country. Millions of elderly Americans were destitute. The Social Security Act created a federal program funded by payroll contributions from workers and employers. When workers retired, became disabled, or died, they and their families would receive monthly payments from the government. It was not a large payment. In the beginning, it excluded many workers. Agricultural laborers and domestic workers who were disproportionately Black were left out of the original law. Historians have noted this exclusion as a significant flaw in the original design, but the framework changed something fundamental. Old age was no longer purely a private problem. For For the first time, the federal government had formally accepted responsibility for the basic income security of its aging citizens. Social Security today is the largest single program in the federal budget. Nearly every American who has ever worked has paid into it. Nearly every elderly American today depends on it in some form. It changed what retirement meant. In 1938, Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act. Before this law, there were almost no federal rules about how an employer could treat a worker. Hours were unlimited, there was no federal minimum wage. Children as young as 6 or 7 worked in factories, coal mines, and fields alongside adults. They worked long shifts for almost nothing, and they could be fired or replaced at any moment. The images from this era are difficult to look at. Children with adult expressions, standing in coal dust, holding machines nearly as big as themselves. The Fair Labor Standards Act established a federal minimum wage. It set a maximum workweek at 40 hours, with overtime pay required beyond that. And it banned child labor in most industries. In practical terms, this meant that, for the first time, a working adult had a federal guarantee of a minimum income per hour. It meant that children went to school instead of factories. It meant that weekends became a real concept for millions of American families. These seem like basic protections now. They were not basic at the time. They were fought over intensely by business interests who argued they would destroy the economy. They did not destroy the economy. They changed daily life for working Americans in ways that are still felt every single day. In 1944, President Roosevelt signed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, the GI Bill. It was designed to help the millions of American soldiers who would return from World War II. What it actually did was reshape American society. The GI Bill offered returning veterans low-cost mortgages, low-interest business loans, tuition and living expenses for college or vocational training, and 1 year of unemployment benefits. Before this law, a college education was largely for the wealthy. Most working-class Americans had no realistic path to higher education. The GI Bill changed that overnight. Nearly 8 million veterans enrolled in colleges, universities, and vocational programs. Campuses that had been small and elite suddenly tripled in size. Entire new universities were built. A generation of engineers, teachers, doctors, lawyers, and business people emerged from families that had never imagined that kind of education was possible. The low-cost mortgages funded a massive expansion of American suburbs. Families who had rented apartments in cities bought houses. Lawnmowers became common. Commuting became a way of life. Historians are careful to note that the GI Bill's benefits were not distributed equally. Black veterans faced significant barriers in accessing education benefits and were largely excluded from the suburban housing boom by discriminatory lending practices and neighborhood restrictions. But for the millions who did benefit, the GI Bill created a post-war American middle class on a scale that had never existed before. In 1964, after decades of struggle, protest, violence, and political warfare, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. It is one of the most sweeping changes to daily life in American history. Before this law, segregation was the legal reality across much of the American South and many parts of the North. Black Americans could be legally barred from restaurants, hotels, theaters, schools, parks, waiting rooms, and water fountains. They could be turned away from jobs based on race. They could be humiliated, excluded, and denied basic participation in public life, all within the law. The Civil Rights Act made all of that illegal. It outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in employment, public accommodations, and federally funded programs. It created enforcement mechanisms to make those protections real. The Voting Rights Act followed in 1965. It outlawed the discriminatory practices, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, outright violence, that had been used for decades to prevent Black Americans from exercising the right guaranteed to them by the 15th Amendment in 1870. These laws did not end racism. Historians and activists have always been clear about that. Enforcement was uneven. Resistance was fierce. The full story of what followed includes ongoing struggle, legal battles, and continuing inequalities. But in terms of daily life, the change was enormous and immediate. For the first time since Reconstruction, federal law enforced the right of every American to sit at a lunch counter, check into a hotel, apply for a job, and cast a vote without being turned away on the basis of who they were. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Americans were living with a different kind of crisis. The air in major cities was becoming dangerous to breathe. Rivers were catching fire. In 1969, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland ignited from the pollution floating on its surface. Lake Erie was declared biologically dead. In Los Angeles, smog made the sky brown on ordinary days. The environmental movement built pressure across the country. The Clean Air Act of 1970 set federal standards for air quality and gave the Environmental Protection Agency power to regulate emissions. The Clean Water Act of 1972 did the same for rivers, lakes, and coastal waters. Before these laws, industries could dump almost anything into the air and water with very little legal consequence. There were no federal standards, no enforcement, no required cleanup. After them, American air and water began a measurable, documented recovery. The same year as the Clean Air Act, Congress passed the Occupational Safety and Health Act, creating OSHA. For the first time, employers were required by federal law to provide workers with a safe working environment. Job site injury rates dropped significantly in the decades that followed. These laws changed what Americans breathed, what they drank, and whether they came home from work in one piece. In 1990, President George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act. Before this law, public life in America was largely inaccessible to people with physical disabilities. Buildings had no ramps. Buses had no lifts. Curbs had no cuts. Sidewalks ended at steps. Hotels, hospitals, schools, stores, and government offices were simply unreachable for anyone in a wheelchair or with significant mobility limitations. Employment discrimination against people with disabilities was common and legal. Someone could be turned down for a job because they used a wheelchair, and there was no federal recourse. The ADA prohibited discrimination against people with disabilities in employment, public accommodations, transportation, and government services. It required new buildings to be accessible. It required existing public spaces to be modified when reasonable. The physical transformation of American life was visible within years. Ramps appeared beside steps. Elevators were installed. Automatic door openers became standard. Curb cuts that disabled advocates had fought for changed sidewalks across the country, something the disability community often calls the curb cut effect, also became clear. Changes made for disabled people turned out to benefit everyone. Curb cuts help parents with strollers, cyclists, and delivery workers. Captions on videos help people in noisy environments. Accessible design, it turned out, made public life better for a much broader population than originally intended. The ADA changed who could participate in American public life. America did not become modern all at once. It changed through laws that reached into kitchens, factories, schools, banks, homes, hospitals, voting booths, and workplaces. Each law in this story began with a problem that ordinary people were living with every day: unsafe food, brutal work hours, exclusion from public life, poisoned air, old age without income, children in coal mines. And each time, eventually, a law changed what was allowed. Some laws expanded freedom. Some restricted it. Some corrected old abuses while creating new injustices. Some took generations to enforce. Some arrived too late for the people who needed them most. Some are still being contested today. But each one changed what daily life in America meant for ordinary people. The history of America is not only written in wars and elections. It is written in the rules ordinary people had to live under every day, and in the long, difficult, unfinished work of changing those rules.